Hello, and welcome to the Anthroposcreen YouTube channel. This is my first video, and I wanted to start my series of videos talking about the core fundamental philosophy that has provided incredible meaning in my life. It's provided direction and helped lead me to a very fulfilling life. I wanted to share this because I know it will be useful to other people as well. This philosophy is a solution to the existential crisis that humans have been facing for decades, centuries, and indeed millenniums. It addresses questions of why am I here on Earth? Why should I wake up every day and fight and struggle to survive? Why should I work? Why start a family? These questions were all probably exacerbated for most people in 2020 when we were stuck at home during the pandemic. Famous writer David Foster Wallace made one of my favorite arguments for developing and living by philosophy that I've ever seen. He made this in the commencement speech, "This is Water." Check out this excerpt.
There is no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And a compelling reason for maybe choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship, be it JC or Allah, be it Yahweh or the Wiccan mother goddess or the Four Noble Truths or some inviolable set of ethical principles, is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough. Never feel you have enough. It's the truth. Worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally plant you.
So in the video, Wallace is essentially saying that we need either a philosophical set of principles, ethical principles, or religion to worship. And I think he uses the word worship in a slightly different way than what we're used to, but it really has a huge impact. If we don't worship either these ethical principles or religion, we will slip into other forms of worship that are very toxic. So religion can provide meaning and direction for many people, often through their faith or through religious teachings that can be found in the Quran, the Bible, in Hindu texts, Buddhist texts, you name it. The problem with religion is that some people don't have faith. Friedrich Nietzsche famously said, "God is dead." He didn't mean that God literally died. He's talking about the loss of faith that happens to a lot of people. For him, he thought that religious faith would essentially go completely extinct. That's not really where I stand. My position is merely to reiterate that philosophy is very helpful for people like me who don't have faith in God or any religion. Before we continue, this is a friendly reminder to like this video, subscribe to the channel, comment below, and if you really love my videos, consider joining the Patreon. For most religions, God provides meaning and defines the rules or ethics that we live by. Not only that, God also explains the creation of the universe often, and often explains the nature of reality. Without God, even the nature of reality comes into question. This is where the study of metaphysics enters the picture. With metaphysics, we can study the nature of reality, what is real and what is not real. And just as ethics can follow from the concept of God, our philosophical meaning and ethics can flow from knowing what is real and what is not real. René Descartes helped us get to what I think is the only viable metaphysical truth or metaphysical foundation that we can build off of. He also was interested in establishing a metaphysical foundation. He wanted to find what he could know with absolute confidence, what is true around him. And in order to achieve this, he conducted a thought experiment where he thought of all the things that actually deceive us in real life. And there are psychological disorders that you can think of where people are imagining things in their day-to-day lives that aren't real and that everyone else in society perceives to be as real. So if you have schizophrenia, for example, or other disorders like this, where that person's disorder is that they're imagining things that are not real. You could also just have hallucinations from other sources. So psilocybin, magic mushrooms can cause very intense hallucinations if you eat enough of them. You can also just have hallucinations from having a fever. So I have pretty severe hallucinations sometimes if I get the flu. A few times I've had really intense flus where I've had hallucinations. And most of this happened during the nighttime while I was dreaming. So dreaming is another example where you are being deceived of reality. And it's probably the most common example that most people have experienced. I know some people don't dream, but if you have dreamed, most dreams are considered non-lucid, meaning you don't know during your dream that it actually is a dream. So those are all examples that we might be more familiar with or comfortable with, but Descartes also talks about an evil genius that could be deceiving us constantly. So like maybe there's a godlike figure who has some sort of magic that can create the experiential world that we perceive around us, but all of that is kind of a magical deception. One of the best ways of understanding this similar concept in modern storytelling is in the film The Matrix. All of these examples are examples of realities where we think what we're observing is real and true, but in actuality, it's not real. And the question is, how do we know we are not schizophrenic? How do we know we haven't been drugged secretly and the experiences that we have are hallucinations? More importantly, and more likely, seemingly, is how do we know that we're not just dreaming right now? When you're watching this video, sitting there watching it, maybe you're just dreaming that you're watching this. Additionally, how do you know you're not stuck in the Matrix and everything that you see and experience around you is not just a computer simulation? The reality is that we don't know, and you can't prove that this experience is not the experience that we're tied in. We cannot prove that the reality that we see around us is not a computer simulation like the one in the Matrix. At last, René Descartes arrives at one of the most famous philosophical conclusions in the entire history of philosophy, which is, I think, therefore I am, or in Latin, cartigo ergo sum. I think, so I must exist. Remember, he's trying to find out what in the world is true. And we think of all these examples where we know that at least part of our experience is not real, but in all of those examples, we still exist. If you're schizophrenic and you're imagining parts of your life that are not real, you still exist as that schizophrenic person. If you are high on psilocybin, on magic mushrooms, the world might be melting around you, and it's not actually melting around you, that's just an illusion, but you still exist as that psilocybin user. If you are in a dream, you might be experiencing an entirely created world, and who knows what informs that world. It could just be from your memories or whatever, but you exist as the dreamer, as the person who is asleep. You still exist. Even if you're in a computer simulation like the Matrix, you still exist outside of that matrix in that story that we're aware of. I think, therefore I am. I must exist. That is a truth that we must accept according to Descartes. If you take Descartes' principle of I think, therefore I am, I know I must exist, and you stop there, it's referred to in philosophy as epistemic solipsism, meaning the only thing that you know is real is that I exist. I don't know if anything else around me is real. I don't know if other people are real, etc. All I know is that I must exist. It's called epistemic solipsism. Descartes continued to argue after I think, therefore I am, and tried to prove that if I exist, then God must also exist. I'm not going to go into reasons why I disagree with that. Just know that I'm starting from a position of epistemic solipsism. And you don't necessarily have to believe in this to ascribe to my philosophy, but I'm just giving you the metaphysical foundation that I'm starting at as a person. And if you are an epistemic solipsist, it is really an interesting effort to try and find some sort of meaning in life. You know, if you don't even know if the people around you are real, the objects around you are real, if you don't know time is real, history and the future is real, like all you know is this moment is real, then what could you possibly find as the meaning in life? Any evidence that you provide for your argument for meaning in life could be argued as an illusion. It could be a dream. It could be a computer simulation. So if you can create a meaning of life or some kind of argument of that nature with this foundation, it's really bulletproof. We have established that having some sort of experience means that I must exist. And if you're having experience, you must also exist in some sense as well. This helps us arrive at what I think is a very fundamental truth that's important to the philosophy that I'd argue we should adopt. And that is that we do exist. And very close to this basic principle, existence takes effort, or at least existence appears to take effort. What do I mean by existing takes effort? If you are watching this and your experience is anything like mine, then I know I have, and you also probably have made an effort to survive until now. And the most basic requirement that we need is to breathe. We need oxygen to survive. We also need to eat. Eating occupies a lot of our time. Not just eating, but finding money to afford food so that we can eat. We also need to drink water. You will die quicker without water than you will without eating. You also have had to find shelter from the cold and the heat. And also, you can think of other direct and quick ways of dying that we've avoided. So, if we've all walked down the street, we've avoided jumping in front of a car, we've avoided drowning in water. If you've ever been to a lake or an ocean, we've avoided falling off the side of a cliff or off of a building, off of a balcony, etc. If your experience was anything similar to mine in your memories, then you probably can remember all sorts of experiences where you've made an effort to survive. And the key point here is that at least we have memory of doing all of these things. A really important part of my philosophy is to establish that existing takes effort. The next really important step in this philosophy is that we should embrace the will to survive. We should embrace this effort within us to try and survive from one day to the next. If you exist and are watching this video, then you must have made all of these decisions to survive until now. And the main argument in my philosophy is you should be consistent with all these basic decisions that you've made to survive and embrace this survival instinct. At this point, I'd like to emphasize how the argument that I'm making now is very close to the philosophical, metaphysical foundation, epistemic solipsism, where we're saying that the only thing that we can know with absolute certainty is that I exist if I'm thinking. This is close to that foundation because all I'm saying is that if you exist, you should continue to exist. And the argument involves using memories. The memories that we have over our lifetime all reinforce the idea that we've done things to continue our existence, to survive. So these are reasons why I think that this argument is close to the principle of epistemic solipsism, but I'd like to reiterate that you don't necessarily need to be an epistemic solipsist to adopt the philosophy that I'm arguing for. I'm just saying it's a really good argument because it's really close to that foundation. Now I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge where the concept of the will to survive has arisen in philosophical history. So there have been other philosophers to discuss this will to survive. In Latin, it's called conatus, and Baruch Spinoza discussed the concept quite a bit in the 1600s. And then also in the 1700s, Arthur Schopenhauer talked about the will to survive, or what he called the will to live. He expanded the concept to be the will to thrive across multiple generations, and ultimately thought that the will to survive was a futile instinct in humans. So he didn't necessarily see it as a good thing. And that's a key difference here, is that these philosophers talked about the will to survive in a descriptive way. I'm talking about it in a prescriptive way. We should embrace the will to survive. The will to survive is also found with Charles Darwin, who came slightly after those philosophers in the 1800s, when he developed the theory of evolution. And this is probably one of the most important theories ever developed in science. It argues that the genetic traits that promote survival are the ones that are passed on to future generations naturally. So if you evolve certain traits that harm your probability of survival, you're less likely to survive than someone who, or some creature who evolves traits that promote your likelihood of survival. Similarly, if we look at evolutionary psychology, we see the will to survive. The traits that are passed along through evolution and become predominant can also be psychological rather than just anatomical or physical. For example, we all know that a tortoise that's hatched on a beach instinctually knows to walk towards the ocean once it's born. No one teaches the tortoise that. The ones that knew to walk towards the sound of the ocean were more likely to survive and less likely to be eaten by predators. There's a school in psychology that also believes that a lot of human behavior can also be explained by our evolutionary past. There are many examples of this in sexual selection, where the traits that people are traditionally attracted to when they're finding a partner are often also traits that help promote genetic survival. I'll go into more detail on this in another video. And while we're on the topic of evolutionary psychology, it's important to note that a lot of the things that help promote our survival often feel amazing. So, for example, if you are extremely thirsty, it's an extremely hot day, and you take a drink, that drink feels amazing. If you're hungry and you eat food, that is also an amazing feeling. Also, the act of procreation is one of the most pleasurable experiences that most people have. And love for your family is also an intense and pleasurable experience, and also helps promote your extended genetic survival. So not your direct survival, but the survival of your genes. We've talked about survival in a few different ways already. We've talked about direct survival in terms of just surviving from one day to the next. And then with evolution and evolutionary psychology, we're talking about survival traits that are promoted over generations of a family or through your descendants. But what really kind of inspired this philosophy for me was watching an episode of The Nature of Things, which is a popular show in Canada with David Suzuki, who's often considered to be one of the most likable and famous Canadians among Canadians. I'm not sure if he's as well known internationally. But in this episode of The Nature of Things, which would have been around early 2000s, he basically framed an argument like this. He talked about the priorities of modernity, where your society puts pressure on us to build a career, buy a nice house, buy a nice car, start a family. You might also be pressured to have nice things to attract other people or show your wealth. Or I'm sure there are other factors going on, just the pressures of capitalism and advertising and marketing. But anyway, most of us strive to get a career, buy a house and a car, and start a family. The career helps you support your family. The house and the car are necessary for most people to have a family. And we put so much effort into getting these material things for survival, most of us without realizing that the environment is what really sustains human civilization. And that this environment that has sustained us throughout our entire life as a species and for millions and billions of years of this life on Earth is really under threat right now. And the contradictory side of this, where a lot of the things that we do to buy our family the things that they supposedly need, that process of consuming all of those things are largely what's causing the degradation of the natural environment around us. And he essentially made the argument that it's so contradictory that what we're doing for survival is also the main thing that threatens us from survival over the next few hundred years. And he's making an argument that we really ought to use that survival instinct that we have to protect the environment. But it's interesting as well because we're going beyond the idea of evolutionary psychology, where we're programmed to protect our family. And in a modern setting, we have to, using our rational brains, realize that it's the environment that helps us survive, and really the rest of the civilization, the infrastructure of civilization that is required for us to survive the way we're living now. And so what we need to do is change that perspective and really change our instinctual behaviors to also do a much better job protecting our environment and generally protecting the survival of human civilization. I tried to find the Nature of Things episode where David Suzuki outlines this argument in a clear and concise way, but I wasn't able to track it down. But I did find this interview where he outlines a somewhat similar argument fairly succinctly, so here you go.
Back then, the savannas were filled with animals in abundance and variety beyond anything on the Serengeti today. And those upright, furless apes who were our ancestors were not very impressive. In number, weren't many of us, in size, in strength, in speed, or sensory abilities. But we did have one special trait: a big brain. It was curious, it was observant, it was creative, and it remembered. Those traits more than compensated for our lack of physical or sensory prowess. And that brain did something no other animal has done. It invented an idea, a concept called the future. The future isn't real. The present is real, and there is a past that we remember. But because we conceived of a future yet to come, we are the only animal that realized we can affect the future by what we do in the present. But we are turning our backs on the very survival strategy of our species that got us here in the first place. Why? We have become so impressed by how smart we are that we take our dominance for granted. We don't feel constrained by our biology because we have microscopes, we have telescopes, we have machines, scuba gear, rockets to space. Besides, most of us live in big cities where we feel we're outside of and above nature.
David Suzuki, in his interview and many interviews, what he's famous for really is talking about the importance of the environment to our survival, to human survival, but also the value that the environment has in and of itself, which he believes. But I think it's worth diving into the idea of global threats to human survival in a lot more detail. There are varying opinions about these threats, I'm sure, from the many different viewers of this video, but when it comes to scientific topics and topics of human behavior, I would always defer to scientists and experts as much as possible. And that's what I'm going to be doing on this channel. But one of my next videos that I'm planning is to really dive into some of these topics of threats to human civilization. Climate change is often understood to be a threat to our survival, although it's a very vague threat, and I don't think most people understand what it might look like if and when climate change hits us in the worst possible way. Also, to explore the topic of the Anthropocene, or the sixth great extinction. There have been 5 other major extinctions on this planet, and scientists believe that we are causing the 6th great extinction on this planet. Nuclear war is also a potential threat to the survival of the human species. And I think when it comes to deferring to scientists and experts, one of my favorite sources is the book Collapse by Jared Diamond, where he talks about how different civilizations throughout history have collapsed because of the mismanagement of their natural resources, or at least not strictly because of that, but that the collapse of those societies were largely influenced by at least one factor, which was problems of resource scarcity. But I'll talk about this in more detail in a future video. The philosophy that I'm advocating for is definitely very timely now, because all of these threats are threats that didn't really exist before 200 years ago. Although this philosophy is very applicable to our current time, I think it is so fundamentally true that it doesn't apply only to this time. It's fundamentally true in a sense that it really should have always been the main philosophy that drives human motivations. So I mentioned before that my philosophy that I'm advocating here is that we should embrace our will to survive. But this is a quite vague recommendation, and I can lean on one of the most popular ethical philosophies in the history of philosophy, utilitarianism, to communicate how you can go about embracing our wills to survive. In traditional utilitarianism, the goal is to maximize happiness as much as possible. So the actions that we ought to do are the actions that promote the most amount of happiness possible for the maximum number of people possible. So, for example, You could spend your money on a yacht, or you can donate to charity that could help thousands of people. To most utilitarians, the priority is people, so you'd want to donate to a charity that helps people. So the obvious choice there is not to spend however millions of dollars on a yacht, but to take that money and donate it to charity, because that would help a lot of people out. My variation on utilitarianism is that instead of maximizing happiness, what's a better thing to focus on maximizing would be survival. What I would advocate for is maximizing our probability of survival as much as possible. So the actions that we ought to do are the actions that promote our probability of survival the most. So we want to focus on mitigating the threats that we talked about earlier to human survival, but not only globally, also locally as well. We want to do as much as possible to eliminate conflict, because conflict between human societies can really spiral into highly risky situations, especially in the nuclear age. We want to minimize the degradation of nature as much as we possibly can. A lot of the things that humans do to survive harms nature to some extent, but we usually have a few choices to pick from, and we want to pick the choice that is least damaging as possible. We want to promote as many solutions as we possibly can to the problems that are threatening our survival, and we want to fight as much as we possibly can those threats and the agents that are behind those threats. And that is really the philosophy that I'm advocating for, is a form of utilitarianism that's focused on survival, which I'm calling Survivalist Utilitarianism. This is a pretty huge variation on traditional utilitarianism. So one question a lot of those advocates of traditional utilitarianism are probably going to ask is, why should survival be the main thing that we're trying to maximize over happiness? And my argument is that survival is more fundamental than any of the other things that we could think of maximizing. Other drivers are secondary to survival. And when we look at evolution, we can see that happiness is quite often derived from survival. We're talking about familial love, eating, drinking water, taking those very fundamental, basic needs that we have for survival. They feel good when we have them. Also, loving relationships are also major things that help us survive in terms of our genetics through evolutionary biology. Those aren't the only things that provide us with happiness, but they're really some of the core main things that provide happiness to a lot of people. And through evolution, we can understand how they would have evolved as things that provide us happiness. If you're Machiavellian or you're Nietzsche, who said that we ought to embrace our will to power, I would also say that survival is a more fundamental driving force than power. I think power is a means to survive, especially if you look at how much access certain kings and powerful people have had to procreate, basically.
What I try to tell you, this country, you gotta make the money first. Then when you get the money, you get the power. Then when you get the power, then you get the woman.
That's one explanation, that power is really derived from our want to survive. But I don't think there's a lot of people who advocate and say that power is the main thing that we ought to strive for in life. But we can talk more about this in future videos. Another important distinction that I'd like to outline is the difference between descriptive and prescriptive aspects of this entire discussion. So I've described human behavior. It's the way that things are. It's the way it is. For example, I know that most people who are watching this video, almost everyone, has prioritized their individual survival up until this point. I'm describing the way that the world is through evolution or natural selection. We're describing the way life is on Earth. Evolutionary psychology, we're describing the way people traditionally behave. What's important here is in philosophy, we're going from a description of the way the world is to a prescriptive recommendation for how the world ought to be. This is where survivalist utilitarianism comes into play. Is I'm saying that we should embrace our instincts and promote our individual survival. We should do what we can to promote the survival of our genes. And in order to do this, we have to look beyond what our evolutionary psychology instincts might be and start focusing as well on promoting survival on a more broad sense, because we need the rest of society to survive. Because we need society to survive, we have to do our best to try to prevent the collapse of civilization and the degradation of the natural world around us. There probably are going to be people that argue that we might not need society to survive, but if civilization does collapse, that probably means that billions of people are going to die. And how do you know that you and your family are not going to be part of the population that does disappear in a civilization collapse? But anyway, that would also be a really good discussion for a future video as well. I started this video, and I'll probably title this video along the lines of something that I found the meaning of life. And to people who are primarily concerned about existentialism, they're going to definitely call out the philosophy of survivalist utilitarianism as circular. The meaning of life is to survive. Why am I here? To survive. This is very circular. It's not answering the question of why am I actually here? I think a lot of people, when they ask that question, they're often asking, why did some sort of God put us on this planet? Why did God create life? As though there were something that intentionally started life in the universe. But I don't think that this philosophy really answers that question, if there is an answer to that question. However, it might not tell us what the meaning of life is, but it is a philosophy that will give you incredible meaning in your life. It will bring meaning into your life if you ascribe to this philosophy. When I say that this philosophy will give your life meaning, it's really talking to the point that someone who ascribes to survivalist utilitarianism is going to be working on projects that help mitigate threats to our global civilization as much as possible, especially at this point in history where it seems like there are quite a few threats against us. What you should be doing is focusing on saving the world. When people talk about the threats that we face currently as a civilization, especially climate change, a lot of people shut down because it feels like almost a problem so big that it's impossible to solve. And it's so scary that a lot of people just psychologically tune out. But if you're able to adopt this philosophy, your main focus of concentration is constantly going to be how can we solve this problem, and fighting the instinct to ignore it and be apathetic. And if you are able to focus on projects that really do help us avoid the collapse of civilization, it feels amazing when they do work out. And even if they don't work out, you feel like you're on the right side of history. I can tell you, after 20 years of ascribing to this ethics and philosophy, the things that you work on really do provide meaning. I'm proud of the things that I've done over the past 20 years, and I'm proud of the values that I've had and this philosophy. If you're still watching, thanks for sitting through this entire video, and I hope that I've explained this philosophy well. If you have any disagreements or questions or comments, please leave them in the comments below. I'm interested in reading other people's thoughts, and I might reply to some of them and follow up videos. And definitely subscribe to the channel, because the focus of this channel going forward is to elaborate on some of these survivalist principles and really view the world through the survivalist lens. I'll look at current events and other decisions that we make collectively as people and individually as people, and think them through this survivalist utilitarian lens. I'll also be making videos on anything that's tangential to this philosophy. So I know I mentioned quite a few ideas in this video that can be elaborated on much further, and I'll be doing this in the upcoming videos. So stay tuned. Bye bye.